Chapter 043. Overwhelmed. Perhaps it was because Sheik knew that Zorian already had a date, much like everyone else seemed to believe, or perhaps it was simply a matter of Zorian being more circumspect with his intentions this time around, but Ilsa didn't send any girl after him in the end. Not that Zorian had stayed at Amaya's place long enough to see that in person, of course. That could have easily left him stuck with an unplanned date for the evening again. But he had left a scrying beacon in the house so he could check up on it periodically. A part of him was annoyed he even cared about that. In the grand scheme of things, such petty drama did not matter in the slightest. There wasn't enough time left in the restart for the consequences of ignoring it to really catch up to him. And besides, he could hardly be blamed for not showing up on a date he had never arranged to begin with. But, well, he was curious. And it wasn't like checking up on the house from time to time was some huge commitment on his part. No, most of his time was spent on hovering on the edges of the invasion proper, trying to spot breakaway groups small enough to ambush. Well, that and repeatedly telling himself that he didn't have to interfere every time he saw the invaders kill helpless civilians, since they were going to be just fine when the loop restarted. The first thing was complicated by the variety of monsters that accompanied the mages, who all had very good senses and came in great numbers. The second was complicated by the sheer brutality the invaders displayed to everyone in their path. For heaven's sake, some of them were breaking into random houses and murdering entire families inside. Not even looting anything, just committing mindless slaughter of non-combatants for no real reason. Madness. He knew stuff like that happened during the invasion, of course, but it was never this personal for him. He was there this time, witnessing the behavior in detail and cold-bloodedly deciding where to engage the invaders and where to move on. And he wasn't talking about avoiding groups that were straight up too big for him to handle. Those were easy to ignore, since he had never felt compelled to help others if doing so would cost him his own life in return. No, he was talking about groups that were entirely manageable with his current skills. Except that he couldn't figure out a way to deal with them without killing everything. And what would be the point of that? He needed Abasan mages alive so he could read their minds. That was what this was all about. An ambush that did not result in subdued mages to interrogate was a waste of time and mana, as well as liable to summon Quatakikal to dispatch him. The ancient lich always personally intervened when someone got too successful against the invading forces. And that was without even considering the possibility that Red Robe was secretly lurking somewhere out there in the city, waiting for a big enough disturbance to clue him in that a time traveler was back in Cyoria. He didn't think that option was very likely, what with Red Robe completely abandoning his support of the invasion lately, but it was not an option he felt completely safe discounting. No, sticking to his original plan and avoiding unnecessary engagements was definitely the right choice to make. Maybe it was a good thing his mind kept going back to the stupid date drama. If nothing else, it gave him something to distract himself with. Fortunately for his deteriorating mood, he soon found a duo of Abasan mages that had strayed too far from their main group and were only lightly defended. While relatively speaking, they had 2 war trolls and 12 skeletons as bodyguards, with another 6 war trolls vandalizing shopfronts not too far from where they were standing, but he was confident he could deal with that if he could surprise them. He made his way towards the group, mentally nudging the Iron Beak whose senses he was tapping into to fly closer to his targets so he could examine them more closely. There was something deliciously ironic about using the invaders' own scouts against them like that, but the real reason he was using the Iron Beaks instead of simply scrying on the invaders was that Iron Beaks had much better vision than he did and could also see in the dark. Very useful that. He had also tried to employ the same trick on the war trolls that hung around the invaders, but found their senses very hard to process. Trolls had terrible eyesight and were colorblind to boot. Their main sense was their ridiculously good sense of smell and, to a lesser extent, their hearing. Not to mention they were far less mobile than the Iron Beaks, and the Abasans kept a much tighter leash on the brutes than they did on their Iron Beak flocks. He wondered. Acting on a hunch, Zorian focused on the nearest Iron Beak flock and tried to dominate the one flying on the tail's end of the flock. It was surprisingly willful for an animal, but his attempt was not contested by anyone and the Iron Beak soon broke off from its group and made its way towards Zorian. How that worked. Nobody seemed to be reacting to his actions either. Convenient. Apparently the Iron Beaks were a bigger weak link of the invasion than he'd thought. He removed a potion vial from his pocket and handed it to the dominated Iron Beak that had landed next to him. It took some time, But eventually he managed to telepathically convey to the magical corvid that it shouldn't clutch the vial too tightly in its claws unless it wanted bad things to happen to it. That done, he directed it to dive bomb the Abason duo with the vial. He would not have been surprised at all if his ploy had ended up as a failure. A lot of it depended on the Iron Beak executing everything flawlessly, since Zorian was only dominating the Iron Beak, not puppeteering it. A dominated creature executes orders to the best of its own ability, not the controller's. That was nice in the sense that there was no way Zorian could have puppeteered the bird precisely enough to pull off something this complicated. It did mean he was a bit of a helpless observer as a result, though. Oh well, even if the ploy failed, it should at least act as a proper distraction for his own attack. The Iron Beak exceeded his expectations. Not only did it approach the two mages from behind, entirely on its own initiative, it dropped the vial at the exact spot Zorian told it to aim at. The exact spot. That had got to be some innate magic ability at work. They were uncannily accurate with their feather attack too, come to think of it. In any case, once the vial hit the ground, it exploded into a cloud of yellow gas that knocked out the two Abasons in a matter of moments. Their bodyguards weren't affected. The war trolls, because their magically enhanced metabolisms kept the knockout gas from working, and the skeletons because they had no metabolism to affect. But once their controllers went unconscious, it became ridiculously easy to goad the war trolls into attacking the skeletons. It took less than a minute before every skeleton was reduced into dust and splinters. He directed his Iron Beak to make a few passes at the two trolls, and the bird interpreted that as send a couple of feather volleys straight at their eyes. Ouch. After which the two former bodyguards ran off to chase the bird in blind anger, leaving Zorian free to approach the two knocked-out mages unopposed. This was the fifth group he ambushed tonight, and the first one where everything had gone so smoothly. He didn't even have to personally fight in the end. He really should use Iron Beaks more extensively in the future. After dragging the two unconscious bodies to some less exposed place, he took a deep breath and dived into their memories. Memory reading, more than any other branch of mind magic, deeply resembled divination in the way it functioned. You had to decide what you wanted to look for, and if you were asking the wrong question, your answer would be worthless or misleading. In Zorian's case, there were four main things he looked for whenever he read the minds of Abason mages. Whether they knew about any mage in a garish red robe, where the primordial summoning ritual was supposed to take place, what they knew about the goals of the invasion, and last but certainly not least, whether they knew anything about the time loop or time travel in general. The same thing he probed the minds of cultists about, really. He was lucky this time in that one of the two mages lying before him was a higher-ranking mage that should hopefully know more than the common grunts he had been dealing with thus far. None of the Abasons knew anything about a mage wearing red robes, and the two men he currently had at his mercy were no exception. Follow-up questions regarding missing members which had left the group around the start of the time loop revealed that despite their inability to maintain discipline during the actual invasion, the Abasons ran a pretty tight ship during the lead-up to it. Anyone who stepped out of line was severely punished by the Abason leadership, and the handful of cases where someone tried to abandon the invasion resulted in Quatakikal hunting them down like dogs as an example to everyone else. Consequently, all such attempts had stopped long before the time loop had begun. As far as Zorian was concerned, that pretty much killed the possibility of Red Robe being an Abason invader. He had suspected as much considering how Quatakikal treated Red Robe during that evening, but it was nice to have more confirmation. It was still possible he was connected to the cult of the World Dragon, which didn't and couldn't exercise anywhere near the same control over its members. As far as the location where the primordial ritual was concerned, none of the Abasons officially knew anything about it, but it was apparently a sort of public secret among group commanders, such as the one whose mind Zorian was currently reading, that the summoning was supposed to take place on top of the hole, or at least as close to it as humanly possible. Zorian felt pretty stupid when he found that out. Of course it was the hole, the city's biggest and most obvious landmark. He had even known that the cult assigned special significance to the damn place, he just never... Damn it. He shook his head. In his defense, the lower-ranking cultists were convinced that the ritual was going to take place in some super-secret place that nobody knows about. As for the goals of the invasion, that was something Zorian found very easy to extract from the minds of his victims, as they knew very few actual facts about that. Only the very top of the Abason leadership seemed to know what they were really trying to accomplish here, And the common grunts were going along with the whole thing almost entirely because Quataqikal was going along with it too. The ancient lich was held in very high regard by the Abasins. As a 1,000-year-old lich, he was an almost impossibly ancient mage and had power and skill to match his age. He was alive back when the gods still spoke to humanity, and was rumored to have been blessed by several of them. On top of all that, he had a reputation for being harsh but fair as opposed to a lot of other Abasin leaders who simply had a reputation for being harsh. He was something of a saint to these people, as strange as that looked to Zorian. The mindset was that if Quataqikal said this was possible and worthwhile to pull off, then it was. It was just that simple. Also, there was a general feeling among the Abasins that Altasians were all a bunch of degenerate weaklings that would surely fall like wheat before the mighty men and women of Ulquin Abasa. Then again, that particular brand of rhetoric was common in Eldamar too, so he didn't think it all that notable in the grand scheme of things. As for time travel, his current victim knew nothing of it, just like everyone else. Wait. There was something. It wasn't about the time loop or time travel, but apparently Eldamar had a secret research facility deep within the dungeon, dedicated to researching time magic. Time dilation to be more precise. The facility was heavily defended with insanely good security measures, as they had to be, considering the sheer depth the facility was located at, so the invaders had decided to leave it alone. Some of the Abasin leaders, notably Quataqikal, were known to be unhappy about that. They felt something important had to be there, if Eldamar was willing to maintain a research facility in such a dangerous environment and wanted to have it. Unfortunately for them, the rest of the leadership felt the number of troops and effort required to crack their defenses could not be justified with such speculative gains. That was interesting. Although the Abasin mage he was memory reading did not know the exact location of the facility, Zorian was pretty sure he did. The map left to him by the matriarch had a number of locations marked on it, 2 of which he had never been able to reach to check out. One was surrounded by Abasin forward bases and patrolled too heavily for him to ever approach it successfully. Zorian presumed this was their main base. The other was ridiculously deep and he never even tried reaching it. He did not think he could survive a journey into such depths. Frankly, he was kind of amazed the Arania managed to map the dungeon that deep, considering even powerful mages would think twice about descending to that depth. He had no proof, but he strongly suspected this was the time magic research facility discovered by the Abasins. And considering the matriarch had marked it down as important, it almost certainly had some relevance to his situation. He dived deeper into the man's mind looking for more information. He felt his victim's mind quake under the severity of the probe but persisted anyway. Any compunction about hurting these people had evaporated after watching them rampage around the city for several hours. The path outlined by the matriarch wasn't the only one apparently, or even the main one. The government did not supply the facility through a perilous journey down the winding tunnels of the dungeon proper. They did it by descending down through the hole until they reached the desired depth, where they had drilled an artificial tunnel into the wall in order to connect the facility with the outside world. Of course, while that path avoided most of the dangers associated with such extreme depths, it was still insanely dangerous for anyone without authorization to be there, so that did not help him much. Maybe if he pushed it too hard, overwhelmed by his, still rather crude and unsophisticated, memory probe, the man's mind collapsed into a chaotic, undecipherable mess. He would be getting nothing more out of him. Damn it. He fired 2 piercers at the unconscious mages, killing them both, and turned to leave, only to find an iron beak watching him closely from a nearby windowsill. It was non-hostile, simply scrutinizing him. Zorian checked the feel of its mind, and found that it was indeed the very same iron beak he had dominated earlier, just like he suspected. His influence over it had dissolved a while ago, though, so that couldn't be the reason why it was so docile towards him. If nothing else, he'd expected it to resent him for overriding its will. He sensed no animosity from the bird, however, just satisfaction and schadenfreude at seeing the Abasin mages dead. Either the iron beaks didn't like the Abasins much, or this particular iron beak was not a fan. So, Zorian said, "How do you feel about helping me kill more of these?" The iron beak cocked its head to the side, uncomprehending. Right, still only an animal if a very clever and willful one. He sent the bird a telepathic impression of 2 of them killing more invaders. The iron beak answered with a shrill screech and a burst of bloodlust so strong Zorian found himself taking a step back from the animal. Hate. Grudge. Right, he mumbled to himself. I'll take that as agreement. He didn't bother to dominate the bird this time. He just instructed it to find another small group of invaders and started looking for more iron beaks to possibly subvert. Zorian subdued 2 more groups after that, neither of which had anything new to teach him, before Quatakikal suddenly teleported in front of him and blasted him in the face with one of those jagged red disintegration beams he loved so much. He died instantly, unable to raise any defenses in time. Oh well, the night had been coming to a close anyway. At least he'd managed to experiment a little with the iron beaks flying around. Sadly, he had discovered that only a tiny minority of them were receptive to his control, and contacting the wrong ones invariably caused the entire flock to descend upon him like a murderous mob. The previously subverted birds also immediately switched sides back to their brethren when this happened, which he really should have expected but somehow was still taken entirely off guard the first time it happened. In any case, the iron beaks definitely hated the invaders for some reason, but turning them against their masters was very difficult. Something kept them loyal, and the few mages whose minds he had questioned for an answer didn't know what it was. They thought of iron beaks as dumb animals and paid no heed to their thoughts and motives. He began the restart in the same general way he had started the last 2 by scouting the state of the invasion, getting his mana crystals, helping Taven clean up the dungeon of monsters, and so on. Except, of course, that he was far more effective at all of those this time around. He also stole a better library card for himself immediately and recreated Kizjenka for Kiriel, among other minor additions. The newest restart, much like the 2 that preceded it, showed no sign of future knowledge by the invaders. This was the 3rd consecutive restart where Red Robe unceremoniously ditched them, and Zorian was starting to suspect this was now a normal situation rather than just a momentary whim. Most likely, Red Robe had completely lost interest in the invasion after their confrontation. The question was why? Why do that after he had spent all those restarts stubbornly handing out knowledge to them? Well, perhaps a better question would be, why had he been doing that in the first place? What did helping the invaders do for him? Was it just a way to keep Zack focused on some highly visible, but ultimately irrelevant quest so he wouldn't question things? Or perhaps a way to muddy the waters, so to speak, and hide the aftershocks of his own actions by regularly inducing a big splash at the start of every restart? Maybe. But the sheer amount of information he provided to the invaders made him think there was more to it than that. It was incredibly optimized to do as much damage to the city as possible. Red Robe must have sunk an enormous amount of time and effort to produce something like that. The outcome of the invasion mattered to him in some personal way. So why stop? What changed? Zorian tried to think of it with a properly paranoid mindset. Red Robe thought that the Arania had brought an unknown but large number of people into the time loop. These people were organized and also crafty enough to evade his notice for years. Not something that would be easy to hunt down and purge. Zorian had also displayed mind magic in their battle, so the one encounter Red Robe had had with these people involved one of the few types of magic that could permanently deal with him. All of this meant that the time loop got infinitely more dangerous for Red Robe all of a sudden. There was a legion of enemies plotting against him and lurking around every corner. If Zorian was in Red Robe's place, would he immediately begin to plot against this group, laying down traps and ambushes and trying to track them down? No, definitely not. He would get away as soon as possible, not just out of Cyoria but out of the entire wider region around the city. If he began the restart somewhere in the city, he would get the hell away at the start of the restart, much like Zack seemed to be doing. He wasn't sure how long he would stay away, but Zack had yet to stop leaving the city at the start of every restart, and he was the reckless one out of the 3 of them. Maybe it wasn't so strange that Red Robe was staying away from the city at the moment. In hindsight, that bit of misdirection by Spear of Resolve had been far shrewder than Zorian had given her credit for at the time. But how long would it be before Red Robe realized that the legions of enemy time travelers simply didn't exist? There was another option. If Red Robe was helping the invasion in an attempt to optimize it so that it could be as effective as possible once the time loop ends, and if the Arania were only ejected from the time loop instead of soul-killed as Red Robe claimed, then any further optimization attempts would be a total waste of time. Once the time loop ended, the Arania would be alive and well again, and any plan developed in their absence would give worse results than the one Red Robe had previously developed. Admittedly, Zorian mostly liked this option because it meant that the Arania were recoverable, but it would also explain a lot of things, such as Red Robe's reluctance to use his soul kill spell more liberally. If soul-killed persons were only gone for the duration of the time loop, That would neatly explain why he didn't use it on non-loopers. That would be entirely counterproductive, since he would still have to deal with them eventually, except that he wouldn't have the option to try out different tactics against them in the time loop, and couldn't find out what worked best. Zorian could only hope that investigating the invaders would bring some answers to his questions. Though if everything else failed, he supposed he could always behave like Zack and simply launch an endless stream of suicidal missions aimed at breaking into the time magic research facility, since that was clearly relevant to the time loop somehow. He was bound to succeed eventually, right? If Zack was able to kill Ogange with that method, then surely he could break into one measly facility. Maybe he was thinking about this wrong. He should outright recruit Zack into the attempt. He was still a bit leery of contacting the other boy, both because that would mean revealing himself to Red Robe if he was monitoring Zack, and because he was not at all sure Zack would be of any actual help to him at this point. But if he was reduced to metaphorically banging his head on the wall, then he might as well involve someone who has spent gods know how many years in the time loop honing the skill at doing exactly that. Something to keep in mind when the time comes anyway. With the start of classes, Zorian decided to approach Rainy again while skipping on the mind magic training with Tinami. He still hoped to get to know the Aope heir better, but it was clear that trying to get close to both Rainy and Tinami at the same time was unfeasible, and Rainy seemed the easier one to handle. He did not recreate his initial request as closely as he had intended, but Rainy agreed to set up a meeting between them nonetheless. Benesek had a spontaneous attack of clumsiness when he had tried to loudly congratulate Zorian and ended up sprawling on the floor of the classroom after tripping over his own 2 feet. It was a funny and mysterious thing, and Zorian hadn't had absolutely anything to do with it, but it sure was nice that he'd only made a scene out of himself instead of himself and Zorian, wasn't it? Still, while he had high hopes that his attempt to get to know Rainy better would go better this time around, the fact was that interacting with her involved a lot of waiting time. He might as well try to get to know another one of his classmates in the meantime. And since female classmates had a high chance of producing the same kind of problems that Tinami had in the previous restart, because that was just how his luck worked, damn it, that someone should probably be a guy. Which one of his fellow male students looked interesting? Oh. Edwin was really interested in golems, wasn't he? He had both of his parents in the golem-making business and couldn't shut up about them the last time Zorian had asked a mildly topical question about the subject. Well, he might as well show Edwin his own golem designs and ask him what he thought. It would be interesting to see how his designs compared to ones made by someone hyper-focused on the field. He waited until classes were over and then walked over to where Edwin and Naeem were talking. Like always when he saw them together, he found it interesting how different the two of them were, both physically and in terms of personality. Edwin was a short boy with pitch-black hair and slightly darker skin tone that hinted his ancestors were relatively recent arrivals from the south, or perhaps even from Mycena. Naeem was a relatively unassuming brown-haired boy of average height, distinguished only by the fact he was rather athletic and fit for your average student. Edwin was talkative and expressive, getting excited easily and often gesticulating heavily when he spoke. Naeem was calm and restrained, like some sort of serene monk who had achieved enlightenment and could thus no longer be fazed by anything anymore. They were like the sun and the moon, yet somehow they'd ended up as inseparable. He had to admit he felt just a little bit intimidated by the prospect of approaching them. He was worried they would be suspicious of him, suddenly approaching them out of the blue like that. Zorian's previous relationship with the two was polite, but very, very distant. They had hardly known each other. Then again, that was an accurate description of his relationship with most of his classmates bar Benesek. But he need not have worried. Edwin was naturally a friendly sort, and only got friendlier when he found out why Zorian was talking to him. And while he did sense some exasperation from Naeem, that was solely because of the topic of the conversation rather than Zorian's presence as such. He was not as crazy about the topic as Edwin. "That's a nice stabilizer for the kind of small doll this is intended for," Edwin said, tracing the relevant glyph sequences with his finger. "I don't think it would work for something larger and heavier like a proper man-sized golem made out of solid steel, but it's downright inspired for this. I'll have to remember this. I don't understand why you put these in though," he said, jabbing his finger at the trio of compressed nodes he used to fine-tune the design. "They're inelegant and just plain unnecessary. The design works perfectly without them, and they don't seem to do anything except randomly tweak things with no rhyme or reason." "Actually, the design doesn't work without those," Zorian said. "All of the prototypes were breaking down on me until I got sick of trying to make it work like it was supposed to and just forcibly tweak things in the manner you're looking at. It works fine now, but it makes altering the design a real pain. I'm hoping you can help me find the underlying issue that's tripping me up. Edwin gave him an incredulous look. Wait, so this is like an actual design? Not just theory work? You've built one of these? Well, yeah, Zorian said. What would be the point otherwise? But isn't that super expensive? Edwin asked curiously. No, it's just moderately expensive, said Zorian. Though in all honesty his sense of what was expensive and what wasn't had probably gotten utterly skewed while he was in the time loop. But I'm funding it out of my own pocket and no one can really stop me from spending my money on whatever I find appropriate. Oh no, I'm not criticizing you, Edwin grinned. Hell, I wish I could do the same. You sure you don't need an assistant or anything? It's a possibility, Zorian said hesitantly. He could see that Edwin was very serious about his suggestion and it surprised him. He had thought he would have to make an effort to get him to cooperate on specific projects, and here he was proposing partnership. How much time can you dedicate to this? Naeem gave a short, amused laugh. He was largely content to quietly sit on the sidelines thus far, but apparently he couldn't resist reacting to this. That sort of thing is all he does in his free time, Naeem said with a light smile. The real question is just how long your patience will last before you tell him to knock it off already and go home. Oh, shut up you, Edwin complained. Like you are any better, Mr. Training. You have your martial arts and I have my golems. I have a lot on my plate lately, so I'm not exactly sure how much time I can dedicate to this. But I think I can spare a couple of hours every 2 or 3 days if you're up for it. I'm up for it, said Edwin. For a chance to see how my designs work in practice, I'd even be willing to wake up before noon during the weekend. What's keeping you so busy anyway? The classes are only starting. Ah, well, I do a lot of independent studies, said Zorian. The golem experiments you already know about, but I also do a lot of studying into spell formula in general as well as alchemy, general-purpose utility magic and so on. I do advanced shaping exercises and practice combat magic whenever I find the time. Sounds a bit unfocused, Edwin said. Impressive that you managed to fit all of that into your schedule, though. Yes, and you still found time to join in the monster hunts, Naeem noticed. I think of that as combat magic practice, Zorian said. Naeem gave Edwin an amused look. Edwin scowled back at him. What? Zorian asked. When I told Edwin I wanted to join a hunter group to practice my combat skills in real situations, he called me an idiot. He said no one else would be dumb enough to risk their lives for training, Naeem said, patting Zorian on the shoulder like an old pal. Well, it seems there are 2 of us. Welcome to the Idiot Club, Zorian. Right, Zorian mumbled. But wait, what other reason would a student like us have to join a monster hunter group? Naeem shrugged. Money. Fame. Duty. Alright, some people get paid to do that stuff. And aren't stuck in a time loop that made stuff like fame and duty utterly unattainable. Before he could actually say anything, another one of their classmates suddenly decided to enter the conversation. Forgive me for butting in like this, said Eston Greer, suddenly speaking up from behind Zorian. But I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. Do you mind if I comment a bit? There was a brief pause as the 3 of them stared at the newcomer. In the end, it was Edwin that broke the awkward pause. We're just talking, man, Edwin huffed. It's not a private club or anything. Go ahead and say whatever you want to say. Zorian glanced at Eston, studying him for a bit. The boy was one of the students he once suspected might be Red Robe. Well, just the 3rd time traveler back then since he hadn't met the guy yet, since his family emigrated to Eldamar from Ulquina Besa. If he was being truthful to himself, the boy's appearance had contributed to those suspicions. Eston was a tall, severe-looking fellow with sharp facial features, dour expression, thick eyebrows, black hair and eyes of such dark brown they looked almost black too. Him being very withdrawn and rarely speaking unless prompted by someone or something did nothing to dispel the rather sinister impression he got from the boy. But as far as Zorian was able to piece out, Eston was really just a normal, albeit extremely intimidating student. He had no links to the invaders and didn't really behave like someone aware of the time loop. Very well, Eston nodded seriously. I was going to note that while most of the students didn't join the monster hunts solely in order to test and hone ourselves in the crucible of battle, they surely considered that an additional point in favor of participating. One can have multiple goals for deciding something. So, you also like combat magic practice? Naeem surmised. Yes, Eston agreed. That is one way to interpret that. And with that we can see that there are 3 of us who wish to test our combat skills and grow. Perhaps we could help each other. Have a meeting so we can trade news and personal styles, spar and other such things. For someone who stayed quiet most of the time, Eston sure was very verbose once he got going. Still, he was all for Eston's idea, since he'd been curious about their level of combat skills ever since he'd heard they participated in monster hunts. Naeem was also interested, so after discussing it for a while, the 3 of them decided to ask Ilsa to let them borrow a training hall sometime in the future. One with actual ground, because apparently Eston's magic didn't work well with indoor environments, whatever that meant. Eston also asked about Edwin joining them, but he wasn't interested. Edwin didn't like to fight and had no interest in honing his combat skills. Zorian assured the golem enthusiast that he still intended to work with him on their golem designs. He just had to figure out a way to fit these 2 new obligations into his already overloaded schedule. Finding a training hall suited to their needs turned out to have been largely a non-issue. The academy had lots of training halls, and most of them were free to use by any student. Not all of them were billed as combat magic training grounds, but they all had basic safety wards in place and could be unofficially used as such. According to Ilsa, such misuse of academy resources had been rampant for quite some time already, and was accepted as normal even by the teachers these days. As such, she recommended they just commandeer whatever place they needed for a few hours instead of waiting a week for the academy to give them an official time slot that may or may not suit them, at a training hall that may or may not be what they needed. They just had to make sure they weren't interrupting a sanctioned study group or some such. Armed with that knowledge, they toured some of the available options until they found a training hall that was really just a walled-off and warded section of academy grounds, and thus had plenty of soil and rocks that Eston apparently needed to really show off. Eston, as it turned out, was one of those people with an innate magical ability. Specifically, he could manipulate earth, rocks and similar materials in an unstructured manner, much like how Zorian could work his mind magic. Eston was rather cagey about the specifics of how his ability worked, since it was apparently his family bloodline and they were trying to keep it semi-secret, but it apparently wasn't immediately usable in its untrained form, and Eston's current abilities were a result of considerable talent and a lot of work. In the handful of mock fights they did to familiarize themselves with each other's skills, Eston used the ability exclusively to levitate large clumps of earth and rocks around himself, interposing them between himself and incoming spells with unerring accuracy. While if he could see the attack coming anyway, he didn't fare so well when Zorian made his magic missile loop back and come at him from behind his back. It also took some time for him to form a sphere, and he didn't seem capable of controlling more than 4 at any particular time, because when Zorian launched an 8-missile swarm at him he simply surrendered and asked him to tone it down in the future. Still, it was a pretty useful trick he had there. Blocking with the spheres didn't seem to take any attention from Eston, allowing him to focus purely on peppering his opponent with offensive spells while his spheres defended him. If he had something more dangerous than magic missile in his arsenal, or if he could actually weave a homing function into those magic missiles, he might have actually posed a problem for Zorian. Well, a problem for him so long as he held back so very badly. He decided in advance that the only spells he was going to display was his mastery of magic missile and basic shield spells, and that appeared to have been a good choice because he was beating both of them pretty decisively even with that. Especially Naeem. As a first-generation mage with no special magic or familial history to draw on, he was limited to the same magic missile and shield combination that Zorian claimed to be limited to, but without the years in the time loop to hone his skills at those 2 spells to near perfection. If he were fighting against pre-time loop Zorian, Naeem would have wiped the floor with him. He had more than twice the mana reserves that old Zorian had, and had clearly known how to cast those 2 spells years ago and had been slowly honing them all that time. On top of that, he was highly fit and agile, and in his fight against Eston he simply dodged every projectile that the other boy sent his way. The old Zorian couldn't weave a homing function into his magic missiles, and would thus not be any more successful than Eston in that regard. But sadly for Naeem, he wasn't fighting Zorian's past self, and thus ended up overmatched in his own game. Zorian's shield was impenetrable to anything the other boy could dish out, and dodging didn't work against Zorian's attacks. After this, Naeem and Eston decided to move on to hand-to-hand combat, probably specifically to spite and one-up Zorian. Knowing he was useless in a fist fight and would just embarrass himself, Zorian immediately bowed out of that, conceding he had no chance against either of them. They were both very smug about that. Well, whatever, let them have their consolation prize. Better than being bitter at Zorian for besting them, that's for sure. In any case, the two of them had no less than 5 rounds of that, and it became obvious by the end that Naeem was just plain better at that than Eston was, despite Eston's greater size and bulk. He would later find out that this was what Edwin had been talking about when he implied that Naeem was just as obsessed with martial arts as he was with golems. He practiced martial arts religiously every single day, and was good enough to get invited to national contests in the field. After that, they decided to share training methods and other advice, something that ended up surprisingly useful to Zorian, since both of them had found some neat little shaping exercises that Zorian never thought to look for, but which ultimately ended up with Zorian doing most of the talking and demonstrating. He expected as much to happen, though. He was the most experienced person among them after all. He left the meeting pleased with how it turned out. Considering that both Naeem and Eston wanted to have another meeting like that, Zorian supposed they were pleased with it too, even though Eston was throwing him some sour looks when he thought Zorian wasn't looking. When they did organize another meeting, though, it wasn't just the 3 of them that showed up. Briam, Capriva and Rainey also showed up, wondering if they could join. Naeem and Eston immediately dumped the decision on him, spontaneously designating him as the group's leader. Lovely. He accepted, of course. If nothing else, he was pretty sure that sending Rainey away would not reflect too well on him and his plans to get closer to her. The problem was that all 3 of them were very raw and untrained when it came to actual combat magic. Briam was admittedly already a member of the hunting group, but that was solely because he had his Fire Drake familiar. His spells were almost entirely centered around supporting that living flamethrower. Capriva was in the process of becoming a member in a hunting group, but also not due to combat magic as such. She got in on the basis of providing her team with alchemical bombs and potions, and was heavily reliant on them herself. Rainey probably had some of her shifter magic to fall back on if really pressed, but she was keeping that part of her a secret, and her mastery of classical combat spells was nothing to write home about. Somehow they still managed to make the meeting work, but it involved a lot more work and responsibility than Zorian was comfortable with. Since he was the leader, it mostly fell upon him to help the newcomers out. At the end of the meeting, he was sought out by Rainey, who handed him an envelope with the time and place for their meeting. It was the same restaurant she had used last time, which he supposed made sense if the owner was a personal friend of hers like Kiana claimed. While this was happening, Zorian was in the process of finalizing his agreement with the Filigree sages. In exchange for transporting them to Cyoria, guarding their salvager crews and transporting their finds back to their home, Zorian had secured 3 different mind magic teachers, one of which was supposed to be an expert in memory reading and manipulation. Said memory reading expert also agreed to probe the minds of up to 5 prisoners that Zorian brought to her and share the findings with him. Finally, and a lot less critically, Zorian was entitled to a portion of the things the Iranian salvager crews found in the settlement. Only important because it gave him the excuse to closely monitor their activities, ostensibly so they wouldn't cheat him out of his due, but really just so he knew how to properly salvage the place in future restarts. Embarrassingly, it took less than 2 days for the Filigree sages to do what Zorian couldn't manage in an entire restart. Apparently the solution to finding the Cyorean web's treasury was to descend down the deep vertical shaft which the Cyorean Arania used as garbage disposal, except that halfway to the bottom was a hole in the wall that led to their treasury. The hole was big enough for an Arania to comfortably pass while lugging cargo, but Zorian would have to crawl to pass through the opening and into the main chamber. The shaft actually had numerous such tunnels of various sizes branching off of it, all but one of which were dead ends, but it wasn't that hard to narrow it down once you knew what the trick was. According to the Filigree sages, shafts like these were the secret to the ease with which the Arania could penetrate even very deep layers of the dungeon without getting slaughtered in the process. While a shaft like that did allow for some of the horrid things from lower layers to reach you easier, they were very defensible and could always be collapsed on invaders if incursions got too frequent. In cases where such shafts didn't exist, Arania were liable to create them via application of stone-shaping spells. The actual treasury was huge. A lot of space was taken up by huge spools of spider silk thread which were presumably the web's primary source of income. But there was also a lot of raw currency there, both in the form of paper notes as well as precious metals and gems. A fair number of alchemical explosives and potions were also there, including heaps of different healing potions that the salvage crews claimed were optimized for Iranian biology. They were very excited about those and wanted Zorian's help in contacting whoever made those. They seemed very dismissive about the possibility that the Sciorian Urania produced those themselves. There were quite a few spell books, alchemical recipe books, or spell formula blueprint compilations, many of them highly restricted, rare or very expensive. The filigree sages intended to cart all of them off back home for research purposes, but they agreed to let Zorian peruse them and copy a few choice bits for his own use. That would be enough to keep him busy until the end of the restart, so he was perfectly happy with that. Finally, the vault held a lot of stuff that was really only of interest to Urania. Leather pouches and straps that Urania used for carting things around, nutrient blocks that were the Urania equivalent of dry rations, things like that. The filigree sages, at least, seemed very intrigued by those, marveling at the Sciorian web's technological sophistication and ingenuity. It all looked very underwhelming to Zorian, but he supposed it wasn't easy establishing a technological society when you have no hands. Amazingly, the treasury was only the tip of the iceberg. There was another secret part of the settlement he had never found, a secret magic research room, which could only be accessed by selectively disabling a few choice bits of the warding scheme in one of the rooms, and then passing through the newly opened hole in the ceiling. Sadly, there was a further layer of defenses even beyond that, and neither the filigree sages nor Zorian had been able to crack the wards on the second door thus far. The leader of the salvagers was starting to toy with the idea of simply smashing the door, but worried that there was some kind of self-destruct mechanism inside that would destroy the contents if the entrance was forced open. That was how filigree sages secured their own magic research rooms, apparently. Finally, there was a room for storing records, which Zorian hadn't noticed simply because it had never occurred to him to try and connect his mind to the one particularly lumpy wall in the back of the settlement. Apparently the bumps were memory stones, magic items that could record thoughts and memories, and which were apparently the Urania's equivalent of written records. Personally, Zorian didn't think this method was nearly as convenient as written records, but the filigree sages claimed this was a much more natural and convenient method for them. So what did he know? The important thing was that the records room held information about most of the dealings and operations the Sciorian web had had with the humans on the surface, barring top-secret ones, and that Zorian could possibly co-opt some of their organization for his own purposes. The filigree sages had no interest in that, seeing as how they intended to simply cart off anything that wasn't nailed down rather than establish some kind of long-term presence, so they simply pointed the room to him and told him to do whatever he wanted with it. Embarrassingly, Zorian remembered noticing the wall the first time he searched the place and thinking its unique texture might be significant. So he dug it up with alteration spells and was disappointed when he found nothing but solid rock behind it. It was after one of these meetings with the filigree sages that Zorian came back to Amaya's place and found Taven waiting for him. Curious. They didn't have another monster hunt scheduled until tomorrow. Maybe she wanted to talk about upping their tempo? They were extremely successful this time around, thanks to Zorian making full use of his future knowledge, so maybe she wanted to strike while the iron was hot. If so, he would have to disappoint her. He had too many things on his plate to devote more time to that. The moment he got closer and she noticed him, however, he immediately realized she wasn't here about something like that. She was upset. She asked to speak to him in private, so he led her to his room and locked the door. He had heavily warded it at the start of the restart with a permanent warding scheme, so there was no need to waste time on privacy spells. "What's wrong?" he asked. "What's wrong?" he asks, she mumbled. Crap, she was upset at him. He didn't remember doing anything to make her upset, though. She took out a light blue crystal and slammed it at the desk of drawers next to his bed. "What's that?" she demanded. "That's a rhetorical question, surely?" Zorian asked, baffled. "It's a piece of crystallized mana, of course." "Yes, but why do you have an entire crate of that under your bed?" she demanded. Zorian frowned. "You've been rooting through my stuff without my permission?" "No, your little sister was," she said. She and Nachka were playing princesses and making crowns out of crystallized mana for the two of them, Kana and Kostyenka. I walked in on them and asked them where they got those pretty stones they were using. Damn it, Kiri. "Okay," said Zorian, taking a big breath to calm himself down. "Putting that aside for the moment, why has this gotten you so upset? Why does it matter if I've got a crate of crystallized mana under my bed?" She balled up her hands into fists, seething in her own frustration and self-loathing. "What? Because everything," she finally shouted, slamming her fist into the nearby wall and causing him to flinch back in shock. Everything. Everything, everything, everything. Taven, please, shouted Zorian, frantically trying to calm her down. Just calm down, you're not making any sense. Was she crying? How can you be so good at everything? She half shouted at him, pushing him away. You're good enough at alchemy that Kale praises you. You create golems in your free time. You're so good at divinations that adult professionals accused me of lying when I told them how good at finding monster nests you are. And you're apparently good enough at combat magic that they're letting you teach your own group. That's not Dash, Zorian tried to explain. Don't try to lie to me, she snapped at him. I know you're a better combat mage than me. You try to hide it, but I can tell. I'm not stupid. I never claimed you are, Zorian assured her. She ignored him. I worked on this for years, she cried. I'm 2 years older than you and I worked so hard. Every day, every weekend, every moment I could spare. I made sure to focus, not spread myself too thin. I live for this. And then I find out that not only are you better than me in the one thing I focused on, you also have time for all these other things too. How are you so much better than me? What am I doing wrong? Nothing, Zorian hastily assured her. You're honestly pretty damn awesome, Taven, and the only reason I got even close to your level is because I'm a dirty cheater who cheats. Then show me how to cheat too, damn it, she shouted. Before he could say anything in response to that, she wrapped him into a hug and started sobbing into his shoulder. He awkwardly returned her hug after a few seconds, desperately trying to think of a way to handle this situation. He couldn't think of anything at the moment. In light of that, perhaps it was a blessing in disguise that Taven didn't look like she would stop crying anytime soon. Chapter 044. A show of trust. The idea that someone might connect all the dots and realize his abilities were way too developed for his age was not a foreign idea for Zorian. He tried to make sure that the abilities he showed to any one person or group were firmly within the realm of possible, but he always knew that a sufficiently curious and dedicated individual could track down enough clues to realize something didn't quite add up. There was no solution to this as far as he could tell. Not unless he wanted to spend most of his time performing an incredibly elaborate and boring act. Something which he wasn't sure he was capable of, and which probably wouldn't be too good for his sanity. Ultimately, he decided that the whole thing was largely a non-issue. As long as he wasn't caught doing something illegal, he could simply tell such amateur detectives to get lost. Well, he'd probably be more formal and courteous about it than that, but that was what it all boiled down to in the end. He was even aware that it might be Taven who caught on to him. In many ways, she was in an ideal position to do so. She was probably the only person who actually had a solid idea of what was normal for him and what wasn't, and was thus far more likely to realize just how abnormal and sudden his current skill growth was. He had been interacting with her pretty heavily lately, giving her lots of material to work with. And lastly, they'd known each other from before. They were friends. She would feel entitled to an explanation of some sort, and would be a lot less hesitant about confronting him than someone else might be. And yet, despite all of that, Taven still managed to completely blindside him in the end. He expected her reaction to be a lot of things, but never did he imagine she would break down into tears. It was just so unlike her. Yes, she was a very emotional girl, but she was also the sort to keep going forward and never let anything get to her. He glanced to the left, where she was sitting on the bed beside him. She was a mess. She had stopped crying for a while now, but after effects were still very visible. Red face, runny nose, the standard stuff. Still, her emotions had leveled off in the past few minutes, so maybe she was ready to talk now? Feeling better? He asked. She lightly punched him in the shoulder as a response. Yes, definitely feeling better. This sucks, she complained. I came here all fired up, ready to get some answers, and in the end we didn't even have a proper fight. I just made a fool of myself. Why couldn't you have been more angry and defensive and Zorian-like? Sorry, he said, mildly confused. He was tempted to ask just how she defined Zorian-like, but decided it would be best if that remained a mystery for now. To be fair, you weren't behaving very Taven-like either. I guess, she conceded. Tell me something. Have you always been this talented? Have you been lying to me this whole time? No, he answered simply. She scrutinized him for a moment, watching for any sign of uncertainty and shiftiness in his eyes and posture, before sighing heavily. Figures, she said. I thought as much. You'd have to be very dedicated to keep up the act for so long, and I can't think of a reason why you'd bother. Still nice to hear it from your own mouth, though. Except, that only leaves one option on the table. That you overtook me in everything, including my specialty, in the few short months since we last saw each other. That. You're wrong, Zorian said, shaking his head. I did not overtake you. I am confident that if we fought, you'd be victorious 9 times out of 10. You're still better than me. If you didn't just use mind magic to incapacitate her right from the start. Or ambush her. Or cover the battlefield in enough explosives to level a building. But he was pretty sure Taven wouldn't count those as real victories anyway, and aside from that his point still stood. It doesn't matter, she huffed. With the kind of ridiculous growth you're displaying, you'll close that gap in a handful of weeks and then leave me in the dust. And you'll have all that other stuff you're tinkering with too. Am I wrong? Sort of, he said. She gave him an annoyed look, so he immediately clarified. It's complex. There is no way I'll be able to close the gap between us in a handful of weeks, as you said. But time flows differently for me than it does for you, so I'll get a lot more than that. What? What the hell are you saying? She asked, giving him an incredulous look. We'll come back to that later. Before I say more on the topic, I want to know what got you so upset about this, he said calmly. Say what? Zorian, you can't say something like that and just go, but we'll talk about that later. This demands immediate clarification. This will be bugging me in the back of my head until I get an answer, she complained. I know, Zorian said, smiling widely. That's why I'm not explaining anything until you tell me what's going on. She glared at him. He only smiled wider. You're evil, she told him, looking away. Besides, I already told you what's bothering me, and I'm pretty sure you heard me just fine. Everything I've done, all the skills I've spent my life honing. If you can surpass it all so easily, then what the hell have I been doing all my life? I don't know what kind of cheat you used, and it honestly doesn't matter because it shouldn't have been enough. I'm good at this and I live for this. You can't just decide one day to pursue the same field as me and then catch up to me in less than 3 months, while not even focusing on it properly. The only way that could be possible is if I were never really that good to begin with. Oh, come on, Zorian protested, quickly wrapping Taven into another hug to forestall a second round of crying he could feel welling up inside of her. That's so totally ridiculous. Why would you doubt yourself like that? How does me being better erase your own accomplishments? Accomplishments? She asked incredulously, pushing him away. What accomplishments? I work as a freaking teacher's assistant, Zorian. For a non-magical class, no less. Do you honestly think that's what I hoped for when I graduated? He winced. So Taven wasn't as sanguine about that temporary setback as she pretended to be. In retrospect, he shouldn't be so surprised by that. While failing to secure herself a mentor immediately after graduation was by no means the end of the world, it was bound to be a severe blow to her confidence. Taven, aren't your parents both battle mages? Zorian asked. How come they haven't pulled some of their connections to find you a mentor, or even just a better job? Oh, my parents would love to find me a mentor, Taven scoffed. In fact, they already have someone in mind. He's one of their old friends who's long left the exciting parts of the business behind him when he lost his leg to a rockworm. He's all about being cautious and minimizing risks, and he never does anything more challenging than routine pest extermination. Of course, that's precisely why my parents want me to learn from him. If they had it their way, I'd be hunting mutated rats until I was 30 or something. Ah, said Zorian awkwardly. He seemed to have walked straight into a touchy subject there. Yeah, Taven said. I love my parents and I know they just want to keep me safe, but we just don't see eye to eye there. Okay, sorry to bring that up then. But really, if the reason you're so upset is that you think you're some kind of failure, well, you can rest easy. You're an awesome combat mage. As awesome as you ever were, and nothing I do can change that. I'm not sure I really believe that, Taven sighed. I couldn't find a mentor. The team I made wasn't going anywhere until I recruited you in it. Meanwhile, my parents keep insisting I'm not ready and that it's a good thing I've had such a slow start of my career. It's nice to hear some encouragement, but it rings a little hollow considering, you know. Taven, I'm not so good because you're secretly bad and nobody bothered to clue you in until now, Zorian said. I'm so good because I had more than 4 years to hone my skills since we last saw each other. Taven looked at him like he had grown a second head. That's right, I'm actually older than you now, Zorian said. With that in mind, it is actually pretty amazing that I am still not capable of casually sweeping you aside in a fight. Sure, I could kill you instantly from an ambush, but if we clashed head-to-head in a battle of pure spell work, I would have to use every trick at my disposal and still wouldn't be guaranteed a win. That is why I keep insisting you're awesome. I don't understand, she said. You don't sound like you're joking, but that's what this looks like to me. How can you be older than me? That's not how age works, Zorian. Ah, did you already forget what I told you earlier? Zorian asked, amused. About how time flows differently for me than it does for you. I seem to remember you said it would keep bugging you until you get an answer. Look, you know I'm not one for riddles and intellectual maneuvering, Taven said crankily. Why don't you just tell me what's happening here, okay? Sure, why not? I've lived through this month before, he said. Many, many times. Every time I die or on the night of the summer festival, if I don't, my soul gets wrenched back in time to the start of the month. It's an endless loop that sees me getting stronger and more capable with each passing restart. Since you don't retain your memories across restarts, my growth appears abrupt and inexplicable to you, but it's really nothing more than your typical gradual improvement. Believe it or not, you're the one that taught me a fair deal of that combat magic you're so jealous of. Shut up. I'm not jealous, she protested. He quirked an eyebrow at her. Out of all of that, that's what you chose to focus on? Yeah, well, at least that one has an easy response, she said. What the hell am I supposed to say about the rest? Sure, it would explain your skills perfectly, but it's just so crazy. Zorian offered. Yes, she agreed. And also terrifying. You're basically saying I'll get killed in a few weeks and replaced with a 1-month younger version of me. And that this isn't the first time this happened, it's just that I don't remember any of it. That's like something out of a horror story. I prefer to think of it as just memory loss rather than death, Zorian said. You're still you just lose a couple of weeks of your life. Repeatedly, she added. Repeatedly, Zorian confirmed. I'm not saying it isn't terrifying, just that I don't think it's equivalent to death. Admittedly, I'm a little biased here. If I thought that the time loop murdered millions of people at the end of every restart, I'd have probably gone insane from stress a long time ago. Ah, she winced. Sorry, I guess I'm still thinking of this as some kind of hypothetical scenario instead of something that's actually happening. Still, assuming you're not just pulling my leg here. And I swear to heavens, Zorian, if you are pulling my leg, I'll glue your mouth shut with that really nasty gunk they use on dangerous prisoners. That's still pretty messed up. And also very unfair. Why are you the only person to remember anything? I'm not, he said. There are at least 2 other people looping with me, possibly more. One of them wants to destroy Cyoria. She stared at him for a second before getting up from her position. For a moment he thought he had gone into too much detail too fast and that she was going to walk through the door, but instead she started looking through his drawers, searching for something. He thought about telling her off for rooting through his stuff like that, but decided to wait and see what she was up to. She eventually found an empty notebook and a working pen in one of the drawers, appropriated one of the larger and thicker books in his room, and then reclaimed her seat on the bed. She opened the notebook on her lap, the heavy book she took serving as an improvised table, and quickly scribbled something down on top of the page. He'd never thought of Taven as someone to take notes like that. There, I'm ready, she said. Why don't you start from the beginning this time? In the end, he wasn't sure whether he had convinced her what he was saying was true or not. She took a lot of notes, asked even more questions, and then just left after telling him she had to think about things. A far better outcome than he had expected to get, honestly. He really hoped she would overcome her disbelief and accept his story. It would be nice to have someone other than Kale to talk to about time loop-related things. Not that there was anything wrong with the Morlock boy, far from it, but sometimes he really wished he could get a second opinion about stuff. Of course, it would hardly be him if that little bit of hope that came his way wasn't soon balanced out by something or someone popping up to complicate things. In this case, that someone was Svim. When he arrived at his office the next day for their weekly mentoring session, he was informed that his training group had been noticed and that Svim was not happy at all that such an amateur had delusions about being fit for a teacher. In order to make him fit for a teacher, Svim decided to step up their schedule. They now met 3 days a week instead of the usual one. He really hated that man. His talk with Rainey was going well in his opinion. If nothing else, she was a lot more relaxed than she had been in the previous restart. She'd even ordered a glass of wine to go with her meal. Of course, he wasn't actually learning anything new from her, since she was telling him the same things she had told him the last time they'd done this, but that was to be expected. He couldn't exactly continue on where they last left off without explaining where he got that information, and he didn't feel like making something up. The week had been stressful enough, he was fine with just going with the flow like this. You know, Rainey said, taking a small sip from her glass, I'm getting the feeling that you already know most of what I'm telling you. Oops. It seemed Rainey was a bit more perceptive than he gave her credit for. He didn't think he was being particularly careless, so maybe she was just that good. Probably for the best that he'd never tried to lie to her then. Sort of, he admitted. Why did you ask me something you already know the answer to then? She asked. So I can compare it with what I already know and see whether you were feeding me a bunch of lies or not, he said. She snorted derisively. I think you've confused me with one of your cat shifter friends. Don't you think it's kind of rude to assume the worst of people like that? So you're saying your visit to our training group the other day wasn't about you testing me to see what I would do? He asked with a smile. Ugh. It was so obvious, huh? Rainey sighed. Well, it wasn't just that. But yes, I wanted to see how you would treat me. And, he asked curiously. What's the verdict? It's good, she said. You didn't lash out at me for being so clearly underpowered compared to you and your buddies, but you also didn't drop everything to spend the entire meeting hovering around me trying to help. A fair treatment. I respect that. I don't want special privileges. So you intend to keep coming then? Yes. As I said, seeing your reaction was just a part of it. I wasn't lying when I said I wanted to get better. There was a brief silence as Rainey seemed to considering something. So Zorian, I'm curious about something, she eventually said. What is it that drives you to try so hard? I mean, you're near the top of the class at every subject and you seem to be good enough for a fourth year when it comes to combat magic. That had to have taken quite a lot of work. What are you trying to accomplish? What an interesting question. His reason for pushing himself at so many magical skills was, of course, that he very much needed them to survive. But that wasn't true for all of them. Some of them he pursued for personal reasons because he had an interest in the field. The funny thing was, he no longer had any idea what he wanted to actually do with his life once he was out of the time loop. Most of the career paths he had been eyeing before he got stuck in the time loop no longer appealed to him. They were too modest and routine for someone of his current skills, and he would only get more capable as time passed. He could do better than that. But better how? Independence, he eventually answered. Rainey gave him a curious look, so he hurried to clarify. My family and I don't really get along. I want to get away from them as soon as possible. Buy my own place, get a source of steady income to support myself, things like that. All true except that he already had the skills to achieve all of that easily. But it was the best answer he could come up with on such short notice. I see, she said. I apologize if I'm overstepping my boundaries, but why aren't you getting along with your family? It's a bit personal, Zorian sighed. And also a long story. But the short version of it is that my parents have never cared much for me. I am the third son and a disappointment. A disappointment? Rainey asked curiously. Do I want to know? You probably already know this, but I have a really famous older brother, Zorian said. Yes, Diamond, she nodded. What about it? I'm not him, Zorian said simply. Ah, she said, drawing the word out. It's that kind of disappointment. But shouldn't your other brother have the same problem then? He does, but he's more charming and social than me, Zorian shrugged. He'll never measure up to Diamond, but he's ultimately all right in their book. Also, Fortov was a selfish asshole and could go straight to hell for all that Zorian cared. Interesting, she said. Let me present you with a hypothetical situation. Imagine it was not Diamond who came first. Imagine it was you and your parents treated you as their chosen son. But then Diamond came about and they promptly switched their favors to this new wonder child. Your time in the spotlight is over, and your parents fully expect you to move aside for their new darling. Do you think you would still have the same attitude you do now? Oh boy. He had a feeling this wasn't really a hypothetical situation at all. Well, he said, swallowing heavily. Truthfully, I don't think it's possible for me to know what this hypothetical me might think and feel. So much would change in my life that I wouldn't be the same person sitting here today. However, assuming someone magically switched me with this alternate version of me, yes, I would have the same attitude. You wouldn't try to fight for your birthright as the firstborn? She asked. No, he said, shaking his head. The alternate version of me, having experienced my parents' favor, might see some value in trying to get it back. I would still seek to strike out on my own as soon as possible. The scenario doesn't change anything for me. I see, she said, lost in thought. Not long afterwards they finished their talk and went their separate ways. As he walked back to Amaya's place, he wondered whether he'd answered her hypothetical situation correctly. She agreed to meet with him next week, so perhaps she would eventually explain what that was about. He spent the rest of his Saturday working on the next golem with Edwin. This one was going to be a little more ambitious, being made out of steel and much bigger than Kostyenka, though not nearly as big as he had originally wanted, since Edwin had informed him that construction of golems taller than a meter in height was prohibited unless one had a special license. He had already broken that law in a previous restart and he was definitely going to break it again in future ones, but there was no need to do so right now. He didn't think Edwin would report him, but he probably wouldn't want to help him break the regulations so brazenly. Them being arrested would be but a brief inconvenience for Zorian, but Edwin wouldn't think of it that way. The next day he immediately left the house in the morning and descended into the tunnels below Cyoria. One way or the other the magic research room was getting opened. If he could not bypass the wards on the entrance, the filigree sages would break down the door to get in, consequences be damned. He didn't really agree with this decision. It had been less than a week since the filigree sages had started their salvaging operations, so he didn't see why they were in such a rush to get it open. Well, okay, they did explain why they were in such a hurry. The Cyorian underground was highly coveted territory among the Arania, being a center of their magical and technological revolution and all, and they were worried that the neighboring webs would swoop in and muscle them out any day now. Of course, Zorian knew from previous restarts that the neighboring webs weren't going to come anytime soon, but he couldn't exactly tell the filigree sages that he had seen the future and that their fears were unfounded. But no matter, even if they ended up destroying the contents, it wasn't some great harm, at least from his perspective. He could always try again in future restarts. He approached the dead settlement and he reached out telepathically to the guards posted by the filigree sages, announcing his arrival. Circle of Fortune and Golden Dust, the overseer of the filigree sages expedition, moved to greet him. Welcome back, Zorian Kaczynski, the Arania greeted. He had told her previously to just call him by his name, but she hadn't taken him up on that. Any news from the surface? Nothing too important, he said. The monster incursions are beginning to peter out, so the number of monster hunters stalking the dungeon should see a sharp drop soon. Good, she said. This place is outside their usual patrol routes, but I still worried some of them would stumble upon it. Are you ready for the attempt? I guess. I still think you're rushing though. We are, she admitted. I'm not casting aspersions on your combat skills, but you're still just one mage. If nothing else, you cannot be in more than one place at the same time. We have to work quickly. They soon arrived at the room that held the research room. 6 more Arania were already inside, 2 of them analyzing the wards while the other 4 waited for a command to break down the door. After conversing with the 2 Aranian ward breakers for a few minutes, Zorian created a floating disk of force to stand on and lifted himself towards the hole in the ceiling where the entrance stood. He took out the ward analysis device from his jacket, the pocket watch that Taven had been hired to retrieve so long ago, and whose absence clued him into the existence of the treasury. He had located it inside the treasury uncovered by the filigree sages and, while he fully intended to dismantle it to see what made it tick, for now it was more useful to him intact, serving its intended purpose. He channeled a divination spell through the device and got to work. From what he and the Aranian ward breakers had been able to tell thus far, there were 3 main layers of defenses on the entrance. The first one would electrocute anyone touching the walls of the entrance. The second one would superheat the air inside it to lethal temperatures. The third one would bring down the entire ceiling on top of wannabe looters. All 3 had complicated and hidden trigger conditions, tied to a detection layer that neither he nor the Aranian ward breakers could figure out. Obviously, the third defense was the priority to disable, but it also appeared to be the defense most sensitive to attempted tampering. The filigree sages had worked out a way to neutralize it, but doing so would no doubt trigger all other defenses, both the 2 they were aware of and any further ones they had yet to detect. The ward analysis device really showed its usefulness, though the detection layer, so Byzantine and obscured from scrutiny in the past, simply unraveled under its power. Was not as bad as he feared. He could do this. He contacted Circle of Fortune and told her he thought he could disable the defenses. The Arania in the room exploded into a flurry of activity, mostly vacating the room in case he overreached and brought the whole room down. Circle of Fortune and the 2 ward breakers, however, remained. The ward breakers would help him in the attempt, while Circle of Fortune simply announced that Sheet had to be there. He didn't argue with her, too absorbed by the task in front of him. Over the course of the next hour and a half, he and the 2 Iranian ward breakers slowly and carefully neutralized the detection layer and then moved on to unlocking the door itself. The door itself had some additional defenses, relatively minor in nature but strong enough to really ruin their day if they triggered any of them. It was to his immense relief then that they managed to get it open without setting off a single one. Unfortunately, that's when the defenses inside the room itself, completely separated from the main ward scheme and therefore undetectable from the outside, activated. If Zorian hadn't reacted immediately by erecting a shield in front of them while simultaneously directing the force platform they were standing on downwards at maximum speed, the incoming explosion would surely have killed them on the spot. Even with that, they ended up crashing painfully on the floor of the cave, dazing them for a couple of crucial seconds. There was no time to sit down and recover, though, because the ruined entrance to the research room was starting to pump sickly yellow gas into the room and Zorian had no intention of seeing what effect it had when breathed in. He held his breath and quickly sealed the entrance with a bubble of force, stopping more gas from pouring in, before casting a spell he'd seen Kiran cast once during the invasion. He raised his hand into the air and concentrated on the gas, causing it to surge towards his outstretched palm, where it flowed into a small, compact ball. Moments later, once he was sure he'd gotten all of the gas, he restructured the churning ball of poison gas into harmless, inert dust and took stock of the situation with Circle of Fortune, who was lucky enough to escape the incident without consequences. The 2 ward breakers were not so lucky. They weren't dead, but it was close. It turned out that Urania could not hold their breath like humans, so they ended up breathing in some of the poison gas in the room before he neutralized it. They would recover, but not anytime soon, so Circle of Fortune asked him to drop them off back at the main Filigree Sages settlement and pick up a new pair of ward breakers as replacements. He later sent some ectoplasmic eyes and other remote sensors into the room to check it out, and found it completely wrecked by the explosion and coated in some dangerous-looking green slime. Circle of Fortune just mentally shrugged, pronounced the entire thing a bust and ordered the entrance to the room walled off with alteration spells to prevent any further surprises coming from there. "Don't beat yourself up over this failure," Circle of Fortune told him. "If we had gone through with our original plan, those defenses would have still gone off, probably killing the entire assault team assigned to breaking down the door. Plus, we'd also have had to deal with other traps you ended up disabling before you ran afoul of that last set. This is a much better outcome." Well, that was one way of looking at it. He left Circle of Fortune to deal with the final cleanup of the situation and went off to find his mind magic teachers among the Arania. It didn't take long for him to track them down to one of the isolated corners of the dead settlements, where the 3 of them were huddled together and engaged in telepathic conversation. Before this restart, such intra-Iranian conversations were completely opaque to him. Telepathy was not language independent, so unless the Iranians spoke in a manner he could understand, he was out of luck. Now, however, one of those teachers had begun to teach him how to understand and use the Iranian telepathic language so he could actually understand a few snippets. He was still a rank beginner at it, of course, but it was enough to understand the general topic of the conversation. They were discussing the 3 strongest neighboring webs, Burning Apex, Red Brand Bearers and Deep Blue, and the threat they would pose to the expedition if they decided to send a war party to Cyoria. Sadly, that was about as much as he could figure out from the conversation. The details totally escaped him. He made a mental note to see if he could find something about the neighboring webs in the records room. It might be a good idea to visit them sometime and see what they had to offer. "Greetings," he sent to all 3 of them. "Am I interrupting something important?" "We're just killing time," Voice of Peace answered for them. She was the teacher that was supposed to help him learn how to interpret Iranian senses, thoughts and memories. She decided on her own initiative that this included teaching him the Iranian language, claiming he would never be really capable of making sense of the Iranian mind without being fluent in it. She was also the most enthusiastic of his 3 teachers, often willing to work with him beyond their officially allotted time or go beyond the strict boundaries of what she was assigned to help him with. "Are you here for your daily lesson?" As he confirmed. "I know I'm a little early, but the project to open up the magic research room was a bit of a disaster." "We've heard," said the Iranian known simply as Hammer, a rather apt name, considering the Arania in question specialized in telepathic combat and favored powerful, unrelenting assault. Circle of Fortune was always the reckless sort. At least you made sure nobody died. I must admit I didn't expect much from you when I heard you were supposed to guard us, but it seems you are actually useful from time to time. Hammer. Voice of Peace protested. I just say it how it is. Hammer responded, not in the least bit contrite. Let's not bicker in front of our student. It sets a bad example, said Memory of Sublime Glories, the last of his 3 teachers. Zorian got the notion that she resented him somewhat and considered the job of teaching a lowly human to be beneath her. Or maybe teaching in general, he wasn't really sure. Either way, she was too professional to let that get in the way of her job, so he had no cause to complain. Are we following the same program we did the last time? I don't see why not, Zorian said. In that case, we will continue where we left off yesterday. As an aside, I will not be able to help you further unless you acquire someone to serve as a practice subject for our next session. You indicated this would not be a problem. No, Zorian stated. It won't be. It should be trivial to ambush one of the cultists and drag him down here for interrogation and memory magic practice. The only thing he was unsure of was whether to go for a low-ranking member who probably didn't know anything but whose disappearance would go largely unnoticed, or if he should aim higher. He would have to think about it some more. Before we start though, I'd like your opinion about something, Zorian said. Oh, what about? Memory of Sublime Glories asked. Is this about that massive memory packet lodged inside your mind, perhaps? This was a problem with learning memory manipulation from the Arania. He had no choice but to let Memory of Sublime Glories inside his head somewhat. He was pretty sure he would detect any serious breach of trust on her part, but it was hard to prevent her from taking a sneak peek at his thoughts every now and then. I thought you said you'd refrain from doing that? He asked her, annoyed. I barely looked, she protested. An Iranian memory packet inside a human mind, especially one of that size, is just very noticeable. Besides, you were just thinking about letting me examine it in more detail, so why are you complaining about that? I'm about to get a much closer look at it anyway. Zorian sighed in defeat. He hated it when the Arania responded to his thoughts before he actually put them into words. It was just rude. Still, she was essentially correct. He needed her to take a look at the matriarch's memory packet and tell him what she saw, because to his own amateur mental senses it seemed to be degrading already. If that was true, then he needed to know how much time he had. After a bit more back and forth, he reluctantly opened his mind to her and agreed to let her take a closer look at his mind so she could figure out what was happening with the memory packet. Thankfully, she seemed to behave herself, so the explosives around his neck remained inert and undetonated. Eventually, she withdrew from his mind and gave him the verdict. I'm afraid you're correct, she said. The boundaries of the memory packet have indeed begun to fall apart. His heart sank. That was precisely what he was afraid of. He wasn't ready. If he opened the package now, he doubted he would get anything out of it. But if he waited... How long do I have? He asked. Hard to say. I've never seen a memory packet that big, so it's hard to judge how the decay will progress. Can stay stable for another 3 months, I think. Maybe 4. If you really want to be certain, though, you'll have to open it within the next 2 months. Isn't there anything that can be done to stop or at least slow the decay? Zorian asked desperately. Repairing memory packets is fairly easy if you're the one who made them, Memory of Sublime Glories said. Far less so if somebody else did. I don't think I could repair something that elaborate, and you would never trust me to tinker that deeply with your mind anyway. I will teach you the basics of the skill if you wish, but to get good enough to repair that thing you will have to secure a better teacher. Any idea where I could find one? Zorian asked. The Luminous Advocates probably have what you need, she said. I heard they can be hard to deal with, though. They drive a hard bargain. Those guys. Well, desperate times called for desperate measures. If nothing else, getting enough money to pay for their outrageous prices should be fairly trivial at this point. In that case, I'd like to postpone our current lesson plan for a bit and concentrate on memory packets and how to repair them, he told her. Of course, she agreed easily. Here's what you do. He returned home later in the evening, tired and depressed. He had hoped to do some more work after his visit to the Filigree sages, but between the failure to secure the contents of the magic research room intact and the confirmation that the matriarch's memory packet had begun to unravel, he didn't feel like doing anything. Oh, you're back. Amaya exclaimed when he entered the house. Your friend has been waiting for you for a while now. She's in the basement with Kale right now. Do you want me to call her or are you going to get her yourself? His friend. Her. Taven, he guessed. Amaya nodded. That was a lot earlier than he had expected to hear from her. This could be either very good or very bad. I'll go see what she wants. You know, the last time your friend visited you, she left the house looking like she had been crying, Amaya said casually. Is there a reason why you're pronouncing friend like that? Zorian asked her suspiciously. You're not breaking young girls' hearts, are you, Mr. Kaczynski? Ugh. There is nothing like that between me and Taven, okay? And besides, if anyone is the heartbreaker here, it's definitely Taven, he protested. She gave him a curious look. I'd prefer not to talk about it, he said, shaking his head. Thankfully, she didn't press the issue, so he went to the basement to talk to Taven and see what she decided. He found her talking with Kale about the time loop, comparing notes and discussing time travel mechanics. So does this mean you believe me? He asked her hopefully. I suppose, she said. This is still all very fantastical and unreal to me, but everything you told me seems to check out. Or at least the parts one can actually check do. And Kale here seems convinced you're telling the truth too. So yeah, I guess I kind of believe you. Is there anything you can tell me that would help me convince you in future restarts? Zorian asked. Kale and I talked about that for a while, she said. I don't know. Any personal information I could give you would just creep me out if you started spouting it off all of a sudden. I'd sooner decide that you've been spying on me or that you're reading my mind than that you are a time traveler. If you just tracked me down at the start of the restart and started showing off everything you've learned inside the time loop, I'd definitely accept that something strange is going on, but I'd probably think you're a shapeshifter in disguise or possessed. It's only because I interacted with you pretty heavily for a whole week that I never doubted that you're, well, you. How about this then? I start the next restart the same way I did this one, joining your group, and I'll wait for a few days for you to get annoyed with my growth spike, and then confront you about it on my own initiative before you have a chance to get really fed up with it, Zorian tried. Tension that he never even noticed until that moment seemed to drain from her shoulders and she sagged in relief. What? He said, frowning. I was afraid you'd just keep duplicating the circumstances that led me here over and over again, she admitted. Even if I don't retain memories of it, I don't want to be repeatedly reduced to tears. It was humiliating once, thank you very much. Truth be told, I wasn't okay with the idea of repeatedly making you cry either, he told her. So that option was definitely off the table even if you were okay with it. She looked away embarrassed. Kale cleared his throat to get their attention. I hate to break up the moment, but we have much to talk about, he said. Yes, Taven agreed, relishing the chance to change the topic. First of all, Zorian, why haven't you contacted Zack yet? This red robe of yours is a threat to you both, and you said yourself that you think he's at the center of all this. It only makes sense to work together. I don't understand your reluctance to talk to him. First of all, there is a possibility that Red Robe is monitoring Zack and tracking his movements. If so, then contacting him would mean revealing myself to Red Robe, Zorian said. Secondly, I suspect that the moment I contact Zack, my whole schedule is getting thrown into the trash can. I have some fairly urgent things I need to do in the near future. I can't drop everything to hang out with Zack. Even assuming he is fairly understanding of my goals, he'll still probably insist on taking part in my activities. Since the things I'm doing require subtlety which he entirely lacks, that's a problem. All in all, I just don't think it's a good idea to involve myself with him at this moment. So what, you intend to avoid a potential ally just like that? Taven asked. Only until I'm done investigating the invaders and I can get the matriarch's memory packet open, Zorian said. After that, I will probably go out and meet with him to see what he has been doing and whether we can help each other. All right, she said, somewhat mollified. That makes more sense. To be honest, I thought you'd be a lot more stubborn about this than that. Kale said you had some sort of grudge against the guy, and I know how you are with your grudges. Well, Kale is wrong. I don't have a grudge against Zack, he said, giving the white-haired boy an annoyed look. But whatever. One problem solved. What else do we need to talk about? Kale ripped out a page out of his notebook and offered it to Zorian. We made a list, Kale said with a smile. Taven had a lot of suggestions. Zorian accepted the piece of paper with a sigh and began to read. She really knew how to pick a day to drop this on his head, didn't she? When it rains, it pours.